Well, first of all, it might be helpful to some people to hear a little bit of your background, your training in psychology, and how you came to be exposed to some of these indigenous ways of healing.
Yeah. Well, my background was after university, I decided I wanted to be in a profession. I think it's a long term, to be of help, to help people. Right? It's kind of a lot of psychologists have that dream. Um, and so I first thought, well, medicine, and I did some pre-med, after graduating from university. Now, how about law school? I went to law school for a semester. Oh, no. And finally ended up in psychology and applied to the program at Harvard in clinical psychology. I think I had one psychology class. At that time, they thought it was enough. And I just happened to come at a point where the professors were Richard Alpert and Timothy Leary. So these were my professors in the clinical psychology program. So it was a very um, rare and, I would say, specialized kind of education that I got there.
That's one way to
There were
put it.
other people who were there. Skinner was there, and Harry Murray was there. Gordon Allport was there. Eric Erickson was there, and Eric Erickson was one of my mentors. And the interesting thing about him was he had no PhD in psychology. He was in the psychology department. As a
Yeah,
matter of fact,
I didn't realize that until reading your book, actually.
yeah, as a
That
matter of fact, he
surprised
had
me.
no PhD at all. But he taught a course that was really very popular. And he was there for about 3 or 4 years, I think. And then finally, they just said, couldn't take it. Not only was he teaching a very popular course, very popular, but he wasn't a real psychologist because he didn't have his PhD. So it was a very unusual environment. And during that time, we all, a small group of us, I would say, probably about 3 or 4 graduate students, were involved also with the psilocybin and the LSD experiments or work. We used to sort of not only doing research, but we did our own personal research, taking the substances and so forth. So it was a very eye-opening, but for me, more like a confirmation of that what is out there,
Hmm.
confirmation of that. So from that to a very kind of chance meeting in my postdoc year of a person named Richard Lee, who had worked in the Kalahari for a number of years. He literally, this was in the 60s, remember, a lot of things were going on there. A lot of money was available for research. He literally said to me, are you interested in going to the Kalahari? Because they do healing there and they alter their consciousness, but with no drugs. Oh, I said, that's very interesting. That's kind of where I'd like to go. And that was the beginning of that. And that was in 1968.
Mm.
So it was not like unusual to go. What was unusual is when I got there to realize that here was a place that the culture was proactively involved with changing consciousness. That was the new vision. But going there, it made total sense. As a matter of fact, I remember feeling, sure, I'll go there. It couldn't be any more, how would you say, any more radical than what I've been through already with psychedelic, you see. But it
Yeah.
was seeing the same intensity of change in consciousness within a cultural context that was normative.
Right.
That was the eye opener.
Yeah.
And then from that point on, hey, Brian, I just realized that if I wanted to pursue these kind of psychedelic visions without the drugs, because I was not interested in pursuing it on that venue, I'd have to kind of be more involved with indigenous communities throughout the world. And that's been the path.
Hmm.
So there, and then Fiji and Alaska and Saskatchewan. And that led to in each case, tell your people about our teachings. Who are my people? Well, at first I thought, sir, white people or Canadians. But then I realized my people really are healers, psychologists, social workers, um, like you,
Mhm.
people like you know what I'm saying? So I realized
Mhm.
that, and it really enabled me to be more focused. And that led to the book, which I see as like a culmination of those years of work where clearly the teachings have general application, but very specific and powerful applications for those of us who are committed professionally or personally to the healing work.
Yeah. Well, and committed not only to healing work, but to a particularly anti-colonial approach to healing work, right? Which is
Absolutely.
who I think are the people attracted to your book.
Yeah,
People looking to do some decolonization within themselves, but then hopefully then through the practice of
exactly.
psychotherapy.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I love how you start out the book with an overview of your journey, and all along the way, there's a critical examination of Western psychology, and there are so many things in there that just really highlighted some of the issues with it and the kind of the hidden aspects of colonialism that are kind of embedded in psychology. And I wonder if you could just give people a sense of what you came to understand about it, and then that's where the work needs to be done, right? Which then you followed up on. But if you could just start with, like, what were some of the things you started to notice were wrong with Western psychotherapy and its assumptions?
Yeah, I think that's you put it really in a good way, Brian, because it's kind of like pervasive and oftentimes invisible, but pervasive. So just to take one example, um, we talk a lot about evidence-based interventions. Is it evidence-based? Meaning, are there studies done to prove that there are particular technique X or Y is effective? And they're often called outcome studies. If you look at indigenous healing approaches, which I think are a model of best practices, and I can talk about some of the things like respect, humility, exchange, um, service orientation that we could use to guide our practice as Western practitioners. But let's go back to the notion of outcome. Outcome depends on there being a measure at a certain point in time, pre and post, that the person entering the treatment benefited from the treatment. And we use that data to say, yes, this is an evidence-based approach, we can use it. The problem with that is it's based on a model of psychology that assumes change can be measured at any particular point, and it can be a measure of change or effectiveness. When in terms of healing, from an indigenous point of view, it's an ongoing process which fluctuates.
Hmm.
You could dip into the stream at a certain point and say, "Oh, this is my outcome measure." But then I'd say to you, "But wait a minute! If you had looked a month later or 2 months earlier, you would have seen something quite different." And it never ends
Right.
from an indigenous. So how could you say it's effective when the person's still alive?
Mhm.
Because they'll go through many more changes. So this notion of outcome, which is the rock bed of deciding which treatments are valid and which are not, does not apply to the concept of healing from an indigenous point of view, which I think is, it's, I don't think it's appropriate to say an indigenous approach to healing. It's a definition of healing.
Right.
It's not just it's a definition of healing. So that's one example where you're fighting against a hierarchy, an institution that's really committed to certain principles that violate the phenomenon they're supposed to be talking about. And it's
Right.
hard, you see, like, like in a graduate program of any kind, the people who run the show are the research people. And the people who run the research people are the quantitative people. I do a lot of advising for theses of qualitative in nature. And what I find is that all the students who are involved with qualitative research, they're trying to show that their research is like quantitative, can be measured in the same way. And then what I tell them is, forget about reliability, forget about measures like that. Those are quantitative. Talk about the quality of the experience, the interaction. So I think that psychology, Western psychology, is so committed to a model that does not allow us to talk about indigenous approaches to healing, which I would say doesn't allow us to talk about healing, that it's a real battle. And this book then, I don't know, it seems to touch a nerve of inquiry of, what should I do? I'm trapped in this kind of box of having to measure, having to count, having to demonstrate with statistics, having to prove my point. And yet I know in my clinical work, it doesn't work that way.